Most people aren't fighting the world. They're fighting a ghost, a voice that was never theirs, but lives in their head like a parasite wearing their face. You wake up with it, go to sleep with it. You try to ignore it, drown it in distractions, scroll past it, but it doesn't go away because it's not just a thought, it's a narrative, a script. And here's the thing no one told you. Your mind isn't just reacting to life, it's scripting it, scene by scene, line by line. And you, without realizing, have been repeating a role written in trauma, edited by fear, directed by pain. You think you're anxious because of what might happen, but your body isn't reacting to the future. It's reacting to a story your mind is projecting. Over and over again, stories of collapse, rejection, loss, failure, stories where you're always the one who breaks, the one who ruins it, the one who isn't enough. Anxiety doesn't come from what is. It comes from what your inner narrator insists will be. And that narrator, that cold, persistent voice, isn't you. It's a collection of everything you were told and believed. Every silence that felt like punishment. Every moment of love that came with conditions. Every look that said, "You're too much," or worse, "You're not enough." You memorized those lines so well. You started calling them truth. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." But this isn't fate. It's fiction, a fiction dressed as fact. So believable it triggers your nervous system as if danger were already here. You plan your sentences before you speak. You overthink messages before you send them. You avoid eye contact. You apologize too often, not because of reality, but because of a story. A bad story. A cruel story. A story you didn't even write, but one you've been living as if it were the only one possible. And here's the quiet, terrifying truth. Most people never question the story. They edit themselves to fit it. They shrink, censor, disappear. They call it just how I am. But what if it's not? What if your anxiety is just your body revolting against a version of you that was never true? A lie lived long enough starts to feel like identity. And once you confuse the script with the self, you stop dreaming, you stop becoming, you just survive. Are you sure the story you keep repeating is even yours? Or is it just the voice of trauma interpreting reality for you? Let's begin there. There's a part of your mind that never sleeps. It doesn't rest when you close your eyes. It keeps directing scenes, ones that haven't happened, but feel like they already have. You see yourself failing before you've begun. You imagine the silence after being rejected, before you've even reached out. You rehearse a collapse that never arrives, and still your chest tightens as if it already did. This is the quiet torment of living with a mind that writes tragedies on loop. Not because it hates you, but because it thinks it's keeping you safe. This tendency has a name, negativity bias. But in truth, it's older than any theory. It's a survival instinct. Your ancestors didn't need hope to survive. They needed fear. And now you inherit a mind that scans for danger, even in love, that mistrusts joy because it wasn't part of the original script. That turns every uncertainty into a potential disaster. You plan every word. You prepare for betrayal. You imagine how you'd survive if they left, how you'd explain your failure before you even try. It's not fantasy. It's emotional rehearsal for a collapse your body already believes is coming. Because here's what most people don't realize. The brain doesn't always distinguish thought from reality, and your nervous system listens to every scene you play. If you imagine humiliation vividly enough, your body will flinch. If you mentally rehearse abandonment, your heart will brace for impact. You sweat, you lose sleep, not from what's happening, but from what never happened and might never happen. It's a mental theater, but the ticket price is your peace. And the exit, it's hard to find when the director lives inside you. And sometimes Sometimes the worst part is how familiar the suffering feels, like a movie you've seen too many times. You already know the ending. You just don't know how to walk out. But what if that's not foresight? What if it's just a loop, a story projected from old scenes, trying to make sense of a world that's already changed? The question isn't, will it go wrong? The real question is, why does your mind need it to? And what would be left if you stopped believing everything it shows you? There's a moment, quiet, unnoticed, when a voice that isn't yours begins speaking inside you. At first, it's just a whisper, then it becomes habit, and eventually, identity. You're not good enough. You ruin everything. You always fail. It echoes with your own tone, your own rhythm, your own vocabulary. So you believe it must be yours, but it's not. It was built, constructed piece by piece from the silences that shamed you, the gazes that reduced you, the punishments that came when you dared to just be. And now, you carry it, not because you chose to, but because you needed to survive. And sometimes, survival means becoming what they said you were, because arguing was too dangerous, because believing in yourself felt like a betrayal of reality. You didn't become cruel to yourself because you wanted to. You became cruel to yourself because someone else was, and you learned that love might depend on agreeing with that cruelty. So now, even alone, you continue the punishment. You continue the voice. And the tragedy is, you think that voice is self-awareness. You call it being realistic, disciplined, accountable. But self-awareness doesn't sound like self-hatred. Self-awareness sees the wound. Self-hatred stabs it again. There's a psychological name for this: introjection. The act of absorbing the voice of those who once defined your worth. And once absorbed, they don't need to be there anymore. You've internalized them. You've become both prisoner and guard. So the voice says, you'll never be enough. And you believe it because it came early, because it came from someone who was supposed to love you, because it feels familiar. But familiarity is not truth. And cruelty, no matter how often repeated, is not a mirror. It's a cage. You don't hate yourself. You just learn to repeat the hatred you once received. You learn to echo the pain, hoping it would one day protect you from feeling it again. But pain doesn't protect, it distorts. And if you don't pause, if you don't question that voice, you'll keep performing a sentence for a crime you never committed. And here's what they never told you. You can question it. You can interrupt the echo. You can whisper something new, even if your voice shakes. You plan the conversation before it happens. You imagine their reaction, rehearse your lines, prepare for the silence. You check everything twice. You question every word you said, not because you're cautious, but because you're terrified. You've convinced yourself that if you control enough variables, you'll finally feel safe. If you anticipate all the ways something could go wrong, maybe it won't. If you never let your guard down, maybe nothing will break. But here's the paradox. The more you try to control, the more anxious you become. Because life doesn't follow scripts. People don't behave like equations, and chaos doesn't ask for permission. Anxiety is not a defect. It's your mind trying to protect you in a world that has never felt stable. So it prepares, it calculates, it rehearses, but it pays in dread. It pays in sleepless nights, clenched jaws, shallow breaths. You don't rest because your nervous system is always preparing for war. There's a term for this: intolerance of uncertainty. But it doesn't feel like a theory. It feels like checking the door 3 times, rereading a message 20. It feels like never being able to relax because something might go wrong and you wouldn't be ready. But no one is ever ready. And the truth, the brutal, honest truth, is that control is an illusion. It's a story we tell ourselves to soothe the terror of being human. Nietzsche once wrote that to truly live is to dance on the edge of chaos, not to dominate it, but to face it without collapsing. You're not weak because you fear uncertainty. You fear it because once unpredictability hurt you. It changed everything. It left marks you're still tracing with trembling fingers. And now, you believe that if you can control everything, you'll never have to feel that again. But the cost of that belief is your peace, your freedom, your breath. You don't need more plans. You need to grieve the part of you that thought safety was found in certainty, because it never was. Some things will break, people will leave, mistakes will happen, and still you will continue. Not because you controlled it, but because you endured it. And endurance doesn't come from control, it comes from knowing you've already survived so much, without a map, without a plan. And somehow, you're still here. You crafted a version of yourself that the world could accept, polite, stable, always fine. You smile when you're breaking. You say it's nothing when it's everything. You function, you endure, you perform. And that performance, it's exhausting, because somewhere along the way you stopped being a person and became a character built for survival, designed not to scare anyone away, trained to keep everything hidden, including yourself. You wear that mask so well, even your reflection forgets your name. But masks are heavy, and when they crack, anxiety screams. Not because you're weak, but because you've been silent for too long. Psychologists call this identity dissonance. But you don't need a term for it. You've felt it. The ache that shows up when you're alone, the panic that leaks through a smile, the quiet collapse after playing the strong one again. You've confused being loved with being tolerated. You think you need to stay small to be safe. You've convinced yourself that honesty is too dangerous, so you vanish a little more each day. Until one day, you don't know who's living your life. You just know it isn't you. And this is the secret weight. It's not your responsibilities that are killing you. It's the emotional dishonesty, the silence, the distance between your truth and the role you're playing. You built this persona to be accepted, but it came with a price. It cost you your voice, your rawness, your needs, and now the real you only comes out when no one's watching, or maybe not at all. But what if the collapse isn't a failure? What if it's your truth fighting to be heard? What if anxiety isn't a flaw, but a rebellion? Because when you live a life that betrays your emotional truth, your soul doesn't go silent. It roars through panic, through exhaustion, through the ache in your chest that words can't explain. It's not your life that's heavy. It's the mask, and one day it will crack, not to destroy you, but to let something real finally breathe. You swear this time will be different. New choices, new people, new beginnings. But somehow, the ending is always the same. You fall into the same patterns. Love that turns cold, dreams that decay in silence, the same kind of emptiness, just wearing different clothes. And each time it happens, you wonder if it's fate, or if you're just broken. But it's not fate, and you're not broken. You're repeating a script. Not consciously, not deliberately, but through every decision that feels familiar, even when it hurts. Because the mind isn't loyal to what's healthy. It's loyal to what's known. And if what's known is pain, then pain becomes home. You call it intuition, you call it attraction, but sometimes what feels magnetic is just your trauma recognizing itself in someone else. There's a name for this: psychic scripting. The invisible blueprint your unconscious follows because uncertainty feels more dangerous than repetition, even if the repetition is killing you. So you end up choosing the same role, the same dynamic, the same collapse, and convince yourself it's just how life is. But it's not life. It's the unresolved narrative your inner world keeps recreating until you notice it and dare to interrupt it. Because your nervous system would rather survive predictable pain than risk the disorientation of change. And here's the most brutal part. Sometimes, your suffering isn't an accident. It's a strategy, a way to confirm the story you've always believed about yourself, that you're unlovable, that you're always too much or never enough, that you'll always be abandoned. that happiness is for other people. So the cycle repeats, and every repetition makes the story feel more real, more final, more inescapable. But it's not truth, it's conditioning, and it can be rewritten, not with promises, but with awareness, with the quiet courage to ask, what part of me is choosing this again? Because even the most painful ending, when observed with honesty, can become the beginning of something else. Did you enjoy the content and it made a difference for you? Click on Super Thanks and support our work. There's a moment, small, silent, when you catch yourself in the mirror and feel a flicker of discomfort, not because of how you look, but because something doesn't match. What you see and what you feel aren't aligned. You turn away, avoid your own eyes, because deep down you're not looking at yourself, you're looking at an echo. The voice inside starts speaking again, not with kindness, not with recognition, but with judgment, a cold narration that dissects you before you even begin the day. You're behind. You always mess this up. You don't deserve better. You listen because it sounds familiar, because it speaks in your own voice. Because over time, you stopped questioning who was speaking. But what if the voice isn't truth? What if it's just noise? A broken mirror doesn't reflect. It distorts. It doesn't reveal who you are. It shows you who you were taught to believe you are. And if no one ever taught you to speak gently to yourself, then self-hatred will feel like honesty. Cruelty will feel like clarity. And silence will feel like safety. There's a quiet technique, not for fixing, but for seeing. For 5 days, write down the phrases that pass through your mind when you're alone, not to judge them, but to see them as if they weren't yours. Read them aloud, not as yourself, but as if you were saying them to someone you love. And then ask, would I ever speak to them like this? Because most of your anxiety doesn't come from what's happening. It comes from the way you narrate what's happening, from a voice that was never questioned, never interrupted, never rewritten. You can't heal what you refuse to hear, and you can't change what you still believe is true just because it's repeated often. Not every thought deserves your trust. Not every reflection deserves your belief. The voice inside is not your enemy, but it might be unexamined, and if you learn to observe it without becoming it, something shifts. You stop reacting, you start witnessing, and that's the first breath of liberation, not from the world, but from yourself, or rather, from who you were told to be. There's a moment no one talks about, not the collapse, not the trauma, but what happens after, when the wound stops bleeding and starts defining you. You carry it everywhere, not as a memory, but as a self. You don't just remember what happened, you become the person who was broken by it. And at some point, the pain becomes familiar. It gives you language, it gives you explanation. It gives you something to hold, even when everything else feels like it's slipping away. You stop asking who you could be without it, because the answer scares you more than the suffering does. Nietzsche called this existential resentment, a silent clinging to victimhood, not for attention, but for continuity. Because letting go of the pain would mean letting go of who you've been. And then what's left? A blank page, a self without a script, a version of you unrecognizable, even to you. The truth is, we don't always fear more pain. We fear the absence of it, because it's all we've known. And without it, we might have to learn to exist differently, softer, braver, unshielded, and that somehow feels more dangerous than suffering. So you stay, not because you want to, but because the pain by now feels like home, like a skin you forgot how to shed, like a cage you stopped trying to escape because at least you know its corners. But here's the quiet tragedy. When suffering becomes identity, healing feels like death. And so you sabotage it, push away what could help, laugh off what could shift you, resist what feels unfamiliar, even if it's peace. You say you want to be free, but freedom comes with disorientation, with silence, with space. And that space, The space where the pain used to live feels unbearable at first, because it's quiet, and in that quiet, you meet yourself, not the version they created, not the one that collapsed, but the one that remains. And maybe that's the one you've been running from all along. Not every story needs to be erased. Some just need to be reread with new eyes. Eyes that aren't trembling, eyes that aren't desperate for validation, eyes that belong to the version of you who finally stopped running. Anxiety is not the villain, it's the narrator. A desperate voice trying to warn you that something in the script is no longer working, that the role you're playing is too small for your truth, that the ending you keep reliving isn't the one you're meant to carry forever. And maybe you're not broken, just caught in a chapter that's already over, but still looping in your nervous system like an old film reel no one remembered to stop. You keep watching it, keep reacting to it, keep living as if the worst part of your story is the only part that counts. But the chapter is over, and you're still here, still breathing, still able to close the book, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Carl Jung once said, "He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens." Maybe this is the moment you stop dreaming someone else's dream. The moment you stop rehearsing the pain as if it defines you. Maybe this is the breath between pages, not the end, but the pause, the stillness, the reckoning. Because rewriting yourself isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the fear, before the noise, before the voice convinced you that survival was your only purpose. You can still change the story, even if the voice says otherwise.